Thank you for coming today for episode 3 of Tales from My Sabbatical, also known as an FDL. My name is Craig Burnside. I'm a professor of biology here at Tarrant County College Southeast Campus, which is near Fort Worth in the great state of Texas. What is an FDL, or Faculty Development Leave? It's where a faculty member can come up with a wild idea and write a proposal and have it go through a very extensive review process. And if the committee and administration feel like it sounds like a good idea, then you get approved for a semester of no teaching duties, full pay and benefits, and they allow you to go pursue your dream, your idea. And back about 2 years ago is when I started coming up with this idea, and it went through the process and was approved. So I'd like to thank everybody that was involved in the approval process. And my plan was to look into the lives of some of the pioneers in the biological sciences. I was given a class one day on Gregor Mendel, and while I was talking robotically, I was thinking in the back of my mind, why was it Gregor Mendel that came up with the rules of genetics and not somebody else? There were a lot of people studying pea plants and genetics and seeking the secrets of how inheritance works. And what was it about Mendel? And so I decided to expand that and include two of the others here. Charles Darwin is episode 1, can be found on YouTube. Gregor Mendel, episode 2. And here we are at episode 3 about Andreas Vesalius, known as the father of genetics. My plan was to figure out, get into their lives, see how they viewed the world. The short answer to why they saw things that other people didn't was because of the way they viewed the world. It was unique. That's the short answer. The long answer is what made their experiences unique. And so I decided to visit their birthplace where possible, visit where they grew up, where they went to school, where they did their work, any museums I could find that were associated with them, visit their final resting place, and contemplate their existence. Now, with the other two, the first two, that was relatively easy. Both of their birth houses are museums, and both of their adult homes are museums as well. Vesalius is a much more, his history is much more clouded and difficult to tease out, and there's not any museums dedicated to him. So my journey in fall of 2024, it took me to England, where I visited Darwin's birthplace and Darwin's adult home, where he went to college at Cambridge, a British Naval Museum. And then I hopped on a plane and I went to Milan. And I did a little something down there that I might save for episode 4. And I went over here to the northeast coast of Italy. This is where Vesalius was a professor, and a lot of this story takes place. Gregor Mendel's studies took me here into the southern Czech Republic, and I spent also a couple of weeks with my daughter in Germany, Czech Republic, and Poland. That might be a later episode as well. So here's a portrait of Vesalius, where Darwin and Mendel both worked in the 1800s. Vesalius was a lot earlier. Vesalius was born on New Year's Eve of 1514. So really 1515, if you want to figure out how old he is during the course of the story. And you can see he lived till 1664. He met kind of a tragic end at a young age. His seminal work, his contribution to science, is in Latin, De Humani Corpus Fabrica, which means on the fabric of the human body. And his was the first good anatomical textbook. It had good descriptions. It had the best illustrations ever. Of course, around that time, the printing press came along about in the mid-1400s, and so they were figuring out how to not just make type, but make illustrations. And I'll tell you more about why his illustrations were so good and very detailed. It's oftentimes called the first work of modern science, and that Vesalius brought anatomy into the modern sciences. So zero in on the places I'll talk about with Vesalius' life. He was born in Belgium. His family is from a part of the Netherlands, right around here. He went to college at the University of Louvain, and I'm going to massacre these foreign words, sorry, which is just outside of Brussels. And he went to the University of Paris. He did some work at Basel, which was a center for publishing, which is right here on the border between Germany, France, and Switzerland. But he was a professor and did most of his main work down here at the University of Padua. Of course, I'm wearing a T-shirt here for you, those of you that are in residence. It says Padua, especially for this occasion. Now, one of the things I'm looking at here, characteristics of each of these individuals I'm looking at, is their family history. Everybody is affected by the environment into which they're born, their rich family history. It affects all of us. You go all the way back to Peter van Wezel, who is Vesalius' great-great-grandfather. And in the earliest recordings of his family, they record being a member of the cult of Asclepius, who was the Greek demigod of medicine. And here's a statue of said Asclepius with the snake wrapped around the staff, which is where the current medical staff with the snake wrapped around it comes actually all the way from way back then. Van Wezel went to the University of Pavia. University of Pavia is that little place I mentioned that's just south of Milan, about a 30-minute drive, 30-minute train ride south of Milan. And he was a physician and an author. Now, a physician, back, I couldn't find dates for when this fellow lived, but it would have to be the mid to late 1300s, is not what we consider a physician today. They didn't diagnose, they didn't do symptoms, they really didn't do anything. He was an author. He wrote a great deal of material and passed it down. And as a child, there was a big library in the Vesalius house, and he would have been fascinated, and our guy Andreas Vesalius would have had access to those writings. Peter's son Jan, his great-grandfather, this would take place in the early 1400s, went to the University of Louvain, which is just outside of Brussels, in 1429, and the university was founded in 1422, so it was a very new university when he went there. And he studied to be a physician, and we see a pattern here already, and mathematics, but not mathematics like we think of mathematics. Mathematics would have been studying and measuring the movements of the heavenly bodies, what we would call astrology today. And he wrote a letter to Pope Eugenius IV, who was actually at that time in residence in Florence, Italy, as a guest of Cosimo de' Medici, saying that there needed to be adjustments to the calendar. The calendar is wrong. And those mistakes didn't get fixed for about another 100 years. So great-grandpa was way, way, way ahead of his time. He became advisor to the Duke of Burgundy, which is in northern France. And here begins a family tradition of serving at royal court. The grandfather took up being the position to marry a Burgundy who married one of the Habsburg archdukes that became the second Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. And so the grandfather is continuing the family tradition of serving the imperial courts at the highest level. He also was an author, and he wrote a book, a commentary on the aphorisms of Hippocrates. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, he's going to come up in conversation here in just a moment. And aphorisms are fancy sayings, things that you would be known for, like Confucius say. And he also made a commentary on one of the volumes of Ad al-Mansurum, which was that was a series of 10 textbooks written in Persia, which is where a lot of the original medical information came from. Those would have been in the Vesalius family library, and he would be very familiar with those works. And we come back to his father, Andreas von Wezel, and he was also a physician to at first Maximilian I, continuing his father's tradition, and then later the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, Van Wetzel is derived from the weasel. We're going to see that Vesalius began his dissecting career, learning about anatomy, claiming to have dissected lots of animals, particularly weasels. And the family crest of the Van Wetzel family contains these weasels on there, I guess. I need to make a family crest for our family, don't I? No weasels on it. It's also to point out that, so this is the grandfather, 1485. That would have been about the same time as Lorenzo the Magnificent in Florence, where the Renaissance was in full bloom, with artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo getting his start. The Leonardo da Vinci would have been about the same time. And while there was a Renaissance in art, there was also a Renaissance in science. And part of the Renaissance in art was that instead of just, how do I want to phrase this? That the artists of the Renaissance sought to depict the world the way it actually was, rather than the words escaping me, some sort of illusion. So they tried to be more accurate with things like perspective and accurate with representations of the human body. And right around 1450, you can see art change to reflect that. So this is not, the Vesalius is not operating completely in a vacuum, a Renaissance vacuum. As a matter of fact, as I tell people about this presentation, some of them say, well, what about Leonardo? Didn't Leonardo do a lot of anatomy work? And didn't he dissect human cadavers? And the answer to that would be yes, about 1500, about 30, 40 years before Vesalius. Leonardo had to dissect his cadavers in secret in the basements of church by candlelight because it wasn't legal. And also, he wrote a nice anatomy text, but he never published anything. Had Leonardo published his work, he probably would be the one recognized as the father of anatomy, but he didn't, and Leonardo was notorious for that. Michelangelo also dissected human cadavers under the same conditions. Read one report of Michelangelo having to blow out his candle and throw a tarp over him and his cadaver while somebody was walking around in the basement, and you can imagine with the lack of refrigeration how pleasant that smelled. So we get to Andreas Vesalius. That's his Latinized name. Of course, he comes from the Van Wetzel family. 1514 to 1564, 50 years old when he passed. Not much is known about his primary education, and that's not uncommon. Probably would have been done locally with some of the clergy from the local church. Then he went to the University of Louvain for his classical education in 1528. Now, if you do a little math there and take 28 minus 14 or 15, he was 13 years old or so when he went off to the college. Talk about early college. There he studied the classical education, which was to study the languages of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, through which at the time the thinking was, if you are exposed and can read these languages, now you can be part of the great Renaissance. And what that means is, the Renaissance means a new birth, a new beginning, where Western Europe was finally starting to discover the texts of the ancients. That after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, texts in Greek and Hebrew were flowing into Western Europe, and they were becoming exposed to the scientific and art community all at the same time. Vesalius dove into his Latin and became very good at it. He didn't really care much about the Greek and never learned any of that, and claimed never to have learned any Hebrew. He was a guy with an attitude. This is what I want to know, and I'm not going to care about anything else. Sometimes I'm familiar with that particular feeling, and I see that on a regular basis. Tell me what I need to know. Then he switched then to the University of Paris to start his medical training. And the University of Paris had had recently got a building dedicated to medicine. He was somewhat disappointed with his experience in Paris, although he really liked his instructors, several of them. But they were very conservative in the old style type of medicine, and they weren't really open to the new ideas. And what I mean by that is medicine and being a physician at the time had nothing to do with anatomy. And I know that now, as I say some of these things during the course of this presentation, remember that this is 500 years ago. And we're looking at the birth of a new way of looking at medicine. And so at the time, anatomy and medicine were completely divorced. If you went to study medicine, you didn't study human anatomy, and they didn't do a lot of dissections there. And it may be that Vesalius participated in 3, maybe 4. And there was one story about how the professor invited him to come down and do the dissections. And at that time, the professors wouldn't do the dissections themselves. They would sit way up high on a podium and direct their student or the dissector into what to do. And evidently, Vesalius very early demonstrated a talent for doing really good dissections. And he probably would have stayed at Paris, except for the outbreak of war between Charles V and his empire and the French king. And so, of course, being a citizen of the empire, he had to leave France. And he went back to the University of Louvain, where he continued his medical studies and his dissection. And I read one account that said the local burgomaster really took a liking to Vesalius and his work. And so I thought, this is one of the things that takes something like this a long time to prepare for. I was like, I had to look that word up. Like, what the heck is a burgomaster? And it turns out it's our equivalent of a mayor of the city, who provided Vesalius with as many cadavers as he wanted. It pays to have friends in high places. So he continued on his dissecting career there. And there was another prominent faculty member at the university named, and there's an emphasis on one of these letters here. I stand no chance of pronouncing Jeremiah Drivier, who was very, very powerful, very prominent, very opinionated, very smart, and looked down on almost everybody. At one point saying that he had to use the words of the barbarian to express any of his ideas to people. And Vesalius made a public statement criticizing said professor, which kind of burnt that bridge. And so off Vesalius went. But now who's in setting the stage, the environment for this kind of medical atmosphere that Vesalius found himself? Goes all the way back to Hippocrates of Cos, who was widely considered the father of medical science. And one thing he did was he said he wanted to separate medicine from superstition. At the time, the thought was if somebody got sick, it was because there was evil spirits inside them. They had done something to one of the gods, and they were being paid back for being an imperfect person. And Hippocrates said, no, you know what? Illness might have a natural cause. And he said things like diet and fitness level and life choices have a bigger impact on health than the evil spirits do. Now, this is in 400 BC. So that's a fairly long time ago. He adhered to the theory of humors, and that's not funny kind of humors, but humor is a term for fluids in the body. And there was 4. There was a debate on how many there were. Of course, it's not completely true, but Hippocrates adhered to that there were 4. There was blood, there was phlegm, there was yellow bile and black bile, and that illness came about from an imbalance in those 4 humors in the place of the body. Now, of course, we know that that's not true, and that was 2,500 years ago. But it's interesting that even that far back, Hippocrates is talking about balance in a medical standpoint. When we talk about human anatomy and physiology, we talk about balance all the time, and anatomy professors are always doing this with their hands, waving them back and forth like a balance if you can't see, and a term called homeostasis, which is the overriding theme of anatomy. So it's interesting that he was thinking about this back way back. And of course, he's known for the Hippocratic Oath. He was the first physician to say that a physician owes some kind of ethical treatment of their patient. And we fast forward about 600 more years to Aelius Gallienus, otherwise just known as Galen, who was the father of anatomy. And one of the things he followed Hippocrates, and one of the things he took from Hippocrates was that I can hear what you say, I can read what you wrote, I can believe what I see. And so he promoted traveling widely, talking to people, and actually getting your eyes on things and making direct observations. So Galen took him up on that. Galen was born in Greece, but he did a lot of his work in Rome, and he went back to Greece. And he was known for, like I say, direct observation. Let's look at something. Let's look at a person. He did dissections on primates, pigs, dogs, but not humans. There was a prohibition about dissecting human cadavers, so no touch dead people. He did become physician to a very prominent royal out in Greece who was had his own Colosseum and did his own gladiatorial fights, and he would be then administering to the gladiators' wounds, and he looked at those wounds as windows into the human body, which literally he couldn't just take somebody and cut them open and see what's in there, but well, you're already cut open, so why don't I look around? In a year previous to him showing up there, 66 gladiators died and only 5 in the year that he was there. So he maybe was a little bit more successful in treating the wounds. Interesting that he wrote anatomy without ever dissecting a human cadaver, like I said, mostly primates, with the analogy that he made was that what we find in the primate is very similar, the same thing in mankind. And he was mostly right. And it went on, his teachings, for 1,800 years, unquestioned. Galen's anatomy was the basis of the teaching of anatomy. Now comes along Vesalius, and of course, Vesalius was brought up underneath the teachings of Galen's anatomy. And as always with human conditions, when you go from an old entrenched way of thinking and start questioning that and proposing new ways of thinking, there is always resistance. That's just human nature. Everybody now Vesalius is still young. Vesalius is, in his early 20s at this point. He's just a young whippersnapper. What do you know, right? And he's questioning these older fellas entrenched, all of them in the Galenistic thought process, and they attack him. For the rest of his life, they attacked him for what they considered anti-Galen teachings. When Vesalius was really, all he was doing was questioning it, finding inconsistencies, and wanting to correct the record. One of the things that Galen said was that in the heart, the lower chambers of the heart, blood went from the right ventricle to the left ventricle, and through invisible little holes in the wall between the two chambers. And Vesalius said there's no holes between these walls. It's not there. It's incorrect. Another thing that was taught by Galen in his text was that the human jawbone was made up of 2 bones. And indeed, in a lot of the primates, it is. In the mandible, this one right here, there's a space. These 2 bones are separate. And in the Halloween theme, you can see in this diagram here, look at this, the human mandible is just 1 bone. So all he was saying was, well, you know what, Galen, I'm actually in the Galenistic theme. I am questioning by direct observation. And he was not right. That didn't stop them from attacking him. So Vesalius goes to Padua. I'll show you where Padua is on a map in a moment. Padua is a very famous, and especially at this time in northern Italy, university that was founded in 1222. The oldest university in Western Europe is the University of Bologna, which was formed in 1080. And after Right around the early 1200s, some of the people, the faculty at the University of Bologna became upset with other faculty members. That never happens in real life. And decided to split off and form a new university in Padua. And one of the reasons why Vesalius went to Padua was that there was a lot more progressive thought process in medicine. Dissections were a lot more common. They wanted to find out the way things really were, and that just wasn't happening in Brussels or Paris. And of course, he hadn't left any friends back home. So over the Alps he goes. And one of the places he visits is Venice. Venice is about 25 miles from Padua. And here's Vesalius with a skull and a cadaver. So the next map I'm going to show you is this area here, northern Italy. And there's Bologna. Florence is way down here at the bottom. Rome would be farther south than that. Milan way up here. There's Pavia, just south of Milan. Bologna, which is known as the Italian food capital. And I've been there a couple times. I can promise that's a good title. Go there and eat. Here's Padua, right near Venice. Now, at the time, this region was ruled by the Venetian Senate, the Republic of Venice. And the Republic of Venice would have been an area up there in northern Italy. It would have included Padua, Vicenza, maybe out toward here, maybe the borders along here. Now, Mantua, Ferrara, and Ravenna were their own city-states, as were down in this area here. But nothing, even though there was borders, and I can't just show you a picture because they changed every year. The borders go back and forth. This whole area, and including the Eastern Mediterranean, were under the control of the Republic of Venice. And of course, Venice is an interesting city, and being that close, Vesalius and everybody else would go to Venice to check it out. While he was in Venice, he met an artist named Jan Stefan van Kalker. Van Kalker was also from Flanders, which was what we would call Belgium now. And so they were countrymen when they met. And Kalker went to Venice to enroll in the school of Titian, who was a very famous Renaissance artist. So he went there as an apprentice to learn art. And now you can see that where the artist is coming in, artist, illustrations, quality. There's a lot of discussion over who made these illustrations. Was it actually Titian or was it Kalker? In some of Vesalius's early works, he attributes the illustrations to Kalker. In some of the later works, he doesn't mention who did them. And they are of a higher quality, so it's suspect that Titian actually did those, which would be remarkable. You know, if you're not a history of Renaissance art, you would put Titian in the same category as far as painting is concerned, as people like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's master. So, of course, then, following in the footsteps and trying to figure out who these people were, being that close to Venice, I had to go to Venice. So terrible. So I did. It was about a 30-minute train ride, and I spent about 2/3 of a day there. It's a really remarkable place. Where Florence always will have my heart. Venice is as unique a place as I've ever been. So water everywhere, obviously, but it doesn't really hit you until you see how much water is actually there. This would be the main cathedral of St. Mark, and the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal looked like 360, Highway 360 at rush hour. Just boats going every which direction. It looked like mayhem. Here's the famous Rialto Bridge. One of the things that surprised me was how wide it is. It's wider than this room is wide. And I'm on just a water taxi. It cost me like $2 to get on this thing and ride all around the Grand Canal. And here's a smaller canal. I went over a little bridge like this, and I saw there's this little boat over here. This is a market. Now, everywhere you go in Europe, there's markets. And one of the things I like about Europe is they take their produce very seriously. And you can buy really good produce just about anywhere on a street corner. Only thing about this one, it was on a boat, just sitting there in the canal. So Vesalius gets Van Kalker to observe and help make some illustrations. And while he's studying for his medical degree, he gets his medical degree in 1537. So 1537, 37 minus 15 is what? 22, 23 years old. He gets his medical degree. He graduated with the highest honors. Magna Sum Excellence or something was the term that they used. And at the time, there was a graduation fee because, you know, colleges will give you a fee just only slightly behind airlines as far as fees are concerned. And so you had to pay when you got your degree. And the Venetian Senate said, you know what? Let's give him a discount. And they charged him what would be equivalent to maybe $10 to us today. They were like, yeah, thank you. And then the very next day, they hired the young man as a professor of surgery, the most prestigious medical position at the University of Padua, which included responsibilities for teaching anatomy. And he wrote a couple of books. The first one he came out with Tabula Sex, that means 6 tables. And he modified that and came out with another publication, Tabula Anatomica Sex, that would be 6 tables of anatomy, which were one of the very first illustrated books on human anatomy ever written. And he attributes Van Kalker as the artist in those 2 publications. And of course, where the University of Padua was, where Vesalius went, it no longer exists for a lot of reasons, World War II being one of them. But I did go walk around there for a while, and this is really an ornate room. I really wish, I mean, I appreciate giving this presentation in this room, and sure as heck the fact that the AV started working. But man, how much fun would it be to sit in a lecture at this big hall? And you can see up here, lined around the linings up here, these are all some of the great scientists that have been professors at the University of Padua. Here's one. You might recognize this guy. He's from a poor boy from a poor family. Galileo Galilei was a professor of physics at the University of Padua. And that's a whole nother story. And I looked into Galileo's life too, and that might be part of episode 4. Here's the panels of all these famous people in the history of science. William Harvey is known for describing the pattern of circulation through the human body in 1626, I think it was. So that was well after Vesalius had passed away. Had Vesalius not met an untimely end, it's likely he would have discovered the pattern of circulation 50 years earlier. They have the podium from which Galileo gave his lectures. And so the tour guide was telling us about this, and I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, Galileo would walk up these steps, just like I walked into this room, and come to the lectern, just like I'm standing before you today, and professorize, and tell you all about very heretical things. Galileo's life is very interesting as well. They have portraits on the wall of all kinds of famous people. Here's the one that I used earlier at the beginning of this presentation for Vesalius. You look down here, you might recognize this name, Gabriele Fallopi. There's a part of the body, female body, named after Fallopi, the fallopian tube. And he was the professor of anatomy after Vesalius. You might recognize this guy's name, Bartolomeo Eustachius. The eustachian tube between your ear and your throat. Now, just as a brief aside, I really like those names. I like the names that honor people. That's great. There has been a push in anatomical publishing over the course of the last 5 or 6 years to change the names of these structures and take the people's name out. So, for instance, instead of the fallopian tube, they want to call that uterine tube. And instead of the eustachian tube, they want to call that the auditory tube. And just for the record, I am completely 100% not on board with that. They're doing that all around the body. And I went to a cardiologist one time and I said, hey, do you know they're changing some of the names of these things? And I told him, we went back and forth a little bit, and he kind of said, no, that's balderdash. The Purkinje fibers will always be named after Purkinje. So I digress. So Vesalius is still in Padua, and you might recognize one of these names here, Jeremiah Drevrier and Pierre Brisson, however you say that. And on the bottom left here is a portrait of Brissot. I could not find any pictures of Drevrier, so I put Leonardo's Vitruvius Man there. There was a big argument. As a matter of fact, I read this described as being the biggest argument in medicine ever, if you can imagine that. And that was about bloodletting as a treatment for disease and where you should bleed the patient. Glad those aren't my doctors. So Drevrier was following the Arabic tradition that said, now remember, they're thinking that it's an imbalance in the humors in the body. And Drevrier said, well, you should bleed somebody from a place far away from where the disease is, so you could draw those humors away and only take out a little bit, as much as you need. Whereas Brissot said, no, you need to bleed somebody right near where the disease is, and you need to take out a bunch so you get the bad humors out. And he gave as an example in the treating an epidemic of pleurisy, an inflammation of the linings of the lungs. And he said that he had great success bleeding people from the upper arm to draw those bad humors out. And they went back and forth, and even the Spanish government got involved and said, no, you know what, you got to do it the way Brissot is saying. And of course, our man Vesalius wanders into the argument. He publishes a letter. One of the things he's known most about is diagramming the venous system. And so he wanders into the argument with his letter, the venesection letter, which describes the anatomy of the azygos venous system, which I must admit, I did not ever hear of this vein until I started working on this project. But this is a vein in the thorax region, the back, that drains not the lungs, but the upper body. And Vesalius just innocently said, if you want to get blood from the place where the infection is, excise a vein that serves that part of the body. And ever since then, they all went, well, that makes sense. And that was the first time, and ever since then, that a physician's diagnosis took into consideration anatomy. And it was that point in 1539 where anatomy and medicine came together, which is one of Vesalius's biggest contributions right there. Now, he doesn't publish his book for another 3 or 4 years. But one of the things about a paradigm shift is that when the old way of thinking becomes cumbersome and obviously wrong to everybody, something happens to like a tectonic plate shifting to like, okay, maybe I should consider this. And this event with the venesection letter is what brought medicine into the anatomy into the medical spectrum. So that's what this is the front part of a person, the anterior. The azygos vein is on the posterior side, but I'll take any opportunity I can to shout out my man Leonardo. So in 1543, Vesalius comes out with his work on the fabric of the human body. And do you recognize this portrait as being the one hanging in the halls of the University of Padua? And I could not find an original picture of what the cover looked like, but this one came up and I thought, I like it. I like this one. A couple things about it. Here we see Vesalius with his cadaver on the table, and everybody gathered around to look. As Vesalius increased in fame, and he increased pretty quickly, if we look at what's 43 minus 15, right? He's what, 30? 28? I don't know. Uh, his dissections became public events, and everybody wanted to see them. Famous, non-famous, student, layperson wanted to come and watch. And there was, today we have anatomical theaters made for this. Well, not today, but in the meantime. But they would have just had a table. In some places, they would erect a temporary stand so people could, bleachers, so people could stand and watch. And so here's Vesalius going through his dissection, and it looks like mayhem going on over here. Somebody hanging on so they can get a good view. We got a couple people arguing down here in the bottom. Well, what do you think about this? No, I think that. People will, and a scientist will argue about anything. I wonder what this thing is over here. Still can't figure that out. And way up here, we see the Vesalius family crest with the 3 weasels way up there. And a skeleton. Quick aside about Vesalius' first skeleton was that back in the day, capital punishment was common. And if you were not of a high social rank, they would hang you and just toss your body off to the side. And it wasn't really good to go grave robbing and be seen walking down the street with a skeleton. So Vesalius would sneak out of the city walls at night and grab a bone here and a bone there and hide it and then bring it in during the next, wrapped in cloth the next day. And it took him a while before he managed to finally get his first articulated skeleton, which he told the people at Louvain, "Oh, I got this in Paris." And they were like, "Nah, no, you didn't." So, like I said, Vesalius did not have an anatomical theater, but they have one at the University of Padua that they built in 1595. And it's shaped like an ice cream cone. And so this room here, we're about to walk in through a door like this. And there's a wall here right now. And you look down there, you can see how steep the walls are. Like I said, shaped like an ice cream cone. So down at the bottom is where the cadaver would be. And then the lower rungs would be where the most senior people were, the other professors, the advanced medical students. And if you were just starting out, you were way up here. This is so close that if you stood here, these people's feet would be very close to your head. And there we can see there's the bottom row, and there's somebody's head right there. So if you were in that first row, you would be only 5 or 6 feet away from the cadaver while you were observing the dissection. Like I said, Vesalius did not have this. But one of the things that Vesalius was known for was that he conducted his own dissections. Earlier I said the professor would sit up on their podium and direct the dissection. Vesalius was, one description I read was that the students would look in awe to see a professor coming down off his podium in order to conduct the dissection himself. So that was kind of, and they only let you in there for a little while. And now imagine the fire danger, because you had to illuminate this with candles and torches, and that thing's made out of wood. And if you want to build a bonfire, that'd be a good way to build it. So a couple of years later, in the early 1600s, they built a dissecting theater at the University of Bologna. And when I went on this trip, this was the 3rd time I had been to Bologna, and I had walked right by the door for this without even knowing it was there twice. And then when I was looking it up to see where it was, I was like, it's right next to the big cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Peter in town. And this would be probably more like what you would get for a dissecting theater, where the people would sit in the benches, the professor would sit up here on the podium and direct the dissection, not doing it personally. Now, when Vesalius publishes his book, this is more or less the end of his contribution to anatomy, his seminal masterpiece. But he's still alive. He leaves academia. He goes over the mountains from Milan to Basel. This is where the book is going to be printed. So he sends all of his stuff over there to Basel. He follows a couple months later in order to do the editing and type proofreading. And he leaves Basel and he joins up with Charles the Fifth's court, which is a little town, Speyer, just south of Mannheim, Germany. And his father was still the emperor's physician at the time, and he asked for a position at court. And so he got one. And I looked for many pictures or portraits of Charles V. I like this one mostly because it has a dog in it. And some of them are just show his Habsburg chin exaggerated beyond belief. But he was one of the Habsburgs. And this also continues the Vesalius family tradition of serving in the imperial courts. So he gets a position at court. He's going to be one of the physicians for the armed forces, for the military, and it's a time of peace. So the emperor says, you know what, go ahead, go back to Padua and, wrap up your affairs there. He gets there, and one of his students, a guy by the name of Columbus, had figured out that Vesalius wasn't coming back and took his spot and started teaching his classes and doing his dissections. And then he was rather surprised when Vesalius showed back up. It's like he kind of disappeared. Vesalius conducted a series of very famous and public dissections while he was at Padua. And then he left Padua, and he was invited to speak, and that means do a dissection at the University of Bologna. And from there we go. I got to move that. He went to the newly formed University of Pisa, the place with the Leaning Tower. Now, the Duke Cosimo de' Medici, the Duke, not the elder, not the one from the 1400s, so this is mid-1500s, had established the University of Pisa, and he wanted it to be a preeminent medical school, and he leaned on Vesalius, hey, we really want you to stay here. And Vesalius said, no, you know what, I'm in the service of the emperor, so it's probably in my best interest to go stay with the emperor. But one of the things that was not lost on Vesalius was the absolute privilege of being able to be a distinguished speaker at the University of Padua, the University of Bologna, and the University of Pisa, three of the eminent institutions of the time. So why did he do that? Why did he abandon his post at the University of Padua and go into imperial service? Well, for one, it carries on the family tradition. The other, he said that he thought that he had pretty much learned what he could learn from dissections, and that he wanted to bring the field of medicine as a complete holistic, humanistic endeavor. And as such, he needed to get out and deal with people. He needed to see sick people. He needed to see people that were injured. And he would have that opportunity as a military surgeon. So he did that for a while. His father retired. His father retired and left him a nice inheritance, including the house in Brussels. Then he got married, and they had one child, a daughter. And Charles V abdicates his throne. Now that just sounds like he just one day says, all right, I'm retired and here's my heir. It took him about a year and a half for everything to go down. And Vesalius ended up with the King of Spain, Philip II, and moving to Madrid, which he hated. First of all, he was a foreigner in Spain, and they didn't like him. They didn't like him because he was possibly arrogant. And there are accounts of Vesalius being arrogant, argumentative. There are accounts of him being soft and gentle and friendly. And there's really no consensus on who he was. I would guess that somebody would have some experience with me that would say that I was warm and caring and compassionate. And somebody else might write an experience with me where I'm argumentative and So that's just human experience. So Vesalius was not having a good time in Spain. He every time he turned around, people were arguing with him and his diagnosis. One person said that what Vesalius does is he comes in and pronounces somebody mortally wounded. So if they die, it's not on him, but if they survive, he's a miracle worker. Yeah, I can see that. So Philip's son, Don Carlos, is off at school in one of these Spanish cities and is chasing a chambermaid for whom he had developed an affection and fell down some stairs and hit his head. And the physicians in that town, they were looking at the prince. They couldn't figure out what was the matter with him. He kept getting worse. Without trying to really, it's hard not to pass judgment. But one of the things that they did was they exhumed a friar, a Fra Diego, whose body was thought to have mystical properties, and they put it in bed with the prince overnight, hoping that that would heal him. And obviously, that didn't work. And the guy was unconscious anyway. He probably would have objected to, get this cadaver out of here. So he's not getting better. The physicians send word to Philip II, hey, you need to probably come and see your son. He's on his way out of here. So, of course, Vesalius, being the prominent physician, rushes to the kid's side with the king, diagnoses what's the matter with the kid, and the physicians are like, no, you're crazy. We're not going to do that. And finally, the king said, yeah, go ahead and do what you said to do. And it turned out that he had an infection behind his eyes. And so he expressed those wounds and cleaned up the infection, and the kid recovered. And so everybody was happy. Vesalius was not happy, though. And then a little while later, Henry, the king of France, he was celebrating in a gala and doing a joust. Now, when you joust with a royal, you're not supposed to hit him with the lance. And the king took one in the eye socket. And so there was a sort of like an agreement between Spain and France at the time. And so King Philip sent Vesalius to attend to King Henry. And Vesalius looked at him and said, no, he's going to die. And they said, but his skull is not cracked. And all the way back to Hippocrates had said that it's possible to die from a brain injury without having the skull actually fractured. And the king died, and there's that. Like I said, one thing about Vesalius is he wrote this about one of his professors in France, in Paris, a Johann Gunther, who he actually admired. He liked this guy. Gunther's contributions were not so much anatomy as they were as a linguist, that he was translating some of these texts from the ancient Greek and the ancient Hebrew into Latin. And so you wouldn't expect that he would be good at dissecting. And it just kind of cracked me up. He said, I would not mind having as many cuts inflicted on me as I have seen him make either on man or other brute, except at the banqueting table. And he liked that guy. So he's trying to get out of this. And so he asked the king, he says, hey, can I get out of here? And there's a lot of back and forth as to what really happened. Vesalius wanted to get away. Was he under threat for his life for assassination? Maybe. Did the king say, okay, I'll release you from your royal service as long as you promise to go? Whatever way, he went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so he goes to the Holy Land, and on his way back, he perishes on the Greek island of Zante, which is down here, just off the Peloponnesian coast. Now, what happened there? Also speculation. They say that he was sick and the sailors thought he had plague and they were going to throw him overboard. And he begged them to put them on shore. That he was recognized by somebody there that arranged for his funeral. That there had been somewhere on that island a plaque that said, this is the resting place of Vesalius the great anatomist. But the plaque's not there anymore. Nobody knows exactly where that is. So I thought about going there and looking. but it was a little bit out of my way, and money was kind of an issue. So here I am sporting my team colors, representing. Of course, life sciences is no longer here. Now it's biology. But there is a statue of Vesalius in a little piazza in Brussels. So I went to Brussels just to go. There's nothing else. Just that in the entirety of Europe. His house is no longer there. It was a nice little statue. And there it is in the little piazza. Nice, pleasant little place. Beautiful fall weather in Belgium at that time of year. I did have some waffles, and they are as good as advertised. Also, French fries. The French fries are really from Belgium. When our World War II vets were there and they had the French fries, they thought they were in France. They didn't know they were in Belgium. So they called them French fries. And so I sat there and I had a copy of his, one of the copies of one of the biographies that I had been reading, and I read a couple pages about the later parts of his life. I sat on that pedestal. I probably spent a little over an hour here at this park. And like I said, Vesalius the man, who was he? A mystery. Certainly a Renaissance man from a standpoint of voracious reader of all kinds of different areas. He wanted to bring all sorts of things together, particularly anatomy and medicine. He did have friends, even though he's often described as being an unlikable guy. And they just described his life as being aware that his contribution was monumental. It happened, it was accepted mostly, really quickly as a unique, monumental contribution to the study of anatomy, far beyond anything that had ever been done, mainly because of the descriptions and the illustrations. That nothing like that had ever been illustrated before that well. He was frustrated because there were some people that resisted his contributions. There were people that resisted him. I told you a couple of them along the way when it was the king's son, and it was 10 days into this kid's illness that finally Vesalius said, all right, well, you've exhausted everything else, including the dead priest. You want to let me have a try at this? And you can imagine how frustrating that was, knowing that you're right, meeting resistance every time you turn around. Misunderstood, because everybody thought he was anti-Galen when he really wasn't. He was just trying to bring anatomy into the modern world and correct in the errors that he found in Galen's teaching. And surrounded by pettiness. Just imagine a royal court. Just imagine anytime you're in a group of people that are ambitious, that they would step over themselves, step over you to get an advantage. And he was particularly frustrated by that at the royal court in Madrid, with what he considered lesser courtiers, all vying for favor with the king, and they would do anything, stab anybody in the back to get it. And he hated that. He hated that about people. So, go back to our original question. Why them? Why Vesalius? When it comes to Vesalius, he was really eager to learn new stuff. He was driven by the desire to observe, and back to what I hear what you say, I read what you write, I believe what I see, and translate that into the modern world. He was a very good writer. He was a very good illustrator on his own. He came across the artists that helped him make even better illustrations. He comes from a long background of physicians, so he was destined to become a physician. And in the face of all the resistance, he still made his contribution. What do these three have in common? And why is it them? And the one thing that pops out to me in my studies is that none of the three of these people had to worry about money in the sense that we do. They didn't have to worry about a mortgage payment. They didn't have to have a car payment because there weren't cars. But they didn't have to worry about something like that. They didn't have to worry about an electric bill because there weren't electricity either. But the normal everyday things that we have to worry about the real reason you have a job. They didn't have to worry about that. Darwin's family was very, very rich. Vesalius' family was well off too, and he was rich later on in life. Mendel, on the other hand, came from poverty. His father was a peasant farmer. And he then, in order to further his education, he became a monk at the St. Augustine Monastery in southern Czech Republic. But even as a monk, living as a monk, he didn't have to worry about where a mortgage payment or paying for where he lived. He didn't have to worry about where his meals were going to come from. He didn't have to worry about anything like that. And I think that allowed these people's minds to be free and worry about the things that they wanted to worry about in their field. They all were very intense questioners of the natural world, and were driven to find answers as to how the actual world really works. Darwin wanted to know, how do populations change over time, and to come up with natural selection, that there was competition for limited resources, and there are going to be winners and losers, and the winners are going to be the ones that pass on their favorable traits to the next generation. Mendel looked at peas like so many other people did, but he broke them down into the individual characteristics of the peas, that like tall plants versus short plants, or white flowers versus purple flowers. And Mendel was also classically trained in statistics, which didn't happen in the natural sciences in the 1860s. And so not only did they have free minds, but they had a wide range, curiosity, and a wide range of experience to bring to bear on the problems of nature that they were seeking. And in a lot of ways, as I look back, I'm no Darwin, Mendel, or Vesalius, but I see a lot of them in my own pursuits as a scientist. And so, not to go on about that, but I also have an upbringing and an education and a way I view the world. And what I tell my students is, as I've told you about these people, the short answer to that question is they view the world differently than anybody else because of their upbringing, their experiences, their education, and that they were unique. But all of us are unique as well. Each one of us sees the world in a different way. That the thoughts and experiences going on in your head have never happened before in the history of the world, and they will never happen again. And so my question to you, my question to my students, what are you going to do with that gift? Thank you so much for coming.